All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the weekly API work group meeting. So we had a few things I had put down to see if we were ready for the agenda this week. The storage backend discussions that's been going on somewhat on Slack. Vipin is out this week, so we will postpone that one till next week. That's what he requested. So, and then of course we wanted to also circle back on our CNI discussion, talk about whether or not we have any of the detailed diagrams ready to start looking at how we might approach that. And then of course there's a topic that Boris brought up that it's really a discussion on how we can launch containers in the DPU and how, we want to do the alignment around the Kubernetes API. What do we want to do? Do we want to look at standards? And what are the thoughts in that area? So, Boris, if you've got the specific questions you wanted to ask, I can open up the floor to let you ask those.
Thanks, Mark. So basically, this is an open discussion. We touched on this topic several times with different people on this call and privately. But I think that what's still unclear to me, we haven't resolved this issue. We're talking about a lot of different applications, for example, CNI. Red Hat presented, Miriam and Bill presented how they view some of the containers or pods running inside the DPU. And we always kind of defer to the lifecycle provisioning, and I want to bring it back here for the discussion. What can we assume running on the DPUs, and what APIs can we actually use to download images and launch pods or containers on the DPU? Can we align on OCI for just the bare metal containers? Can we assume Kubernetes control plane, or at least some of it? Maybe a proxy API server is running. Are we sending intent-based YAML files to the DPU to specific TCP socket? Or, can we assume, I don't want to, but can we assume like Podman running, and Podman has remote REST APIs that we can use, same for Docker. So what are the thoughts around this? Let's say we have an application in mind, let's say CNI, and now somebody wants to launch and deploy it. Maybe people think this is out of scope. Maybe people think we can, easily resolve this. I'm just really interested to hear like what different thoughts. I see Billy also joined. So what are the different thoughts around that specific area?
Dan, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I think this is a good idea, but I'd want a motivating use case to make sure that we're not off building our own solution, but are being driven by, a use case that's coming in, or someone says, oh, I have my application and I want it to run on all the IPU DPUs in OPI. How do I do that? Right? I'd want it to be from that perspective, so that we're slaying the dragons that they care about, as opposed to sort of building out the stuff that maybe you would be doing if you were building your own solution. So if we can somehow bring it back to maybe what either the Nginx use case or the Kubernetes use case, come back to one of those and have that motivate that infrastructure, then I think this is a great idea.
Yeah, and as I said, it's two use cases here. First of all, let's say distributed firewall or Nginx coming and want to deploy distributed firewall on DPUs. And the second use case, like we'll be discussing on this call for quite a while, is, let's say, OpenShift presented the CNI offload into the DPU. As far as I understand from Billy and Miriam, we don't assume Kubernetes running on DPUs. It can be a simple container that implements a functionality. Obviously, Kubernetes on DPUs helps with lifecycle management and stuff like that. That's easy. But let's say this is a use case. And my question is, two use cases in front of us. How can we deploy that application? Either it's Nginx, third-party firewall, or CNI containers and pods. How can we deploy them into DPUs?
So the question is, how can we deploy them on the DPU? So, like we said, or you had mentioned in your preface that I don't think we can assume Kubernetes. I know from a Red Hat point of view, I think we probably will have Kubernetes running on the DPU, but I don't think OPI should require it. I mean, if it's Kubernetes running on the DPU, then you have your management down there to deploy it. If it's not Kubernetes, I mean, someone can either use Podman or Docker or, some other type of scripting to manage it.
But I don't want to end up with solution that somebody needs to SSH into DPUs and run Podman commands, right?
Right.
Or Docker commands.
Which
So
is why,
even if
like,
it-
I believe Red Hat will be running Kubernetes down there, but I don't know from a OPI if we there's also well, we're talking about the Kubernetes use case here. So
The question that I have to you, because again, I'm not a developer in OpenShift or anything like that, but the question that I have is, can we pick maybe a tiny component from the Kubernetes control plane, I don't know, API server or something like that, and assume that that can be run and standardized upon, so we only send intent-based YAML files, and then people can, I don't know, I'm just, brainstorming. And then people can implement their own solution if they don't want to run kubelet.
So I'm not sure that it helps to standardize on the Kube API unless you're going to actually mandate Kube. Given that the OCI spec is much lower level, I think mandating the OCI spec makes sense, and then making it possible to run the Kubernetes as an orchestration API with an external, REST accessible API is desirable. I don't know if it's worth exploring mandating a Podman or Docker API, assuming they're compatible, as the baseline.
But OCI, correct me if I'm wrong, Donald, OCI does not mandate or discuss at all the REST APIs. So what?
No, that's right. So the question is, one, orchestrate on box OCI. Yes, I think that has to be a mandatory requirement. And then we need to discuss how we expose that off box. And I guess that's the essence of what you're trying to get at here.
Yeah, I'm trying to do it again. Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to see how externally we can deploy that. Either way, I don't want us to build proprietary APIs, obviously. I don't think that we can align, let's say, Podman and Docker, at least from my last check, those are different REST APIs, so we cannot standardize on those. So my only thinking that potentially we can standardize specific on Kubernetes APIs, even if we don't run Kubernetes inside the DPUs, but it's still the APIs looks good enough and abstract enough for us to standardize on those. But correct me if, again, this is very open brainstorming session.
Yeah, we use Docker already in IPDK, and I'd hate to have to change that. So to Podman or something else. So yeah, but at the same time, I don't think I should be that shouldn't dictate anything, right, in OPI. So I think we would try to float above that particular choice.
As I understand it, and it would need just a bit of verification, that Podman at least provides a Docker compatible API as a subset of its whole API. And if that
the REST API,
Yes, the REST API, and if that Docker subset is sufficient for us, then maybe that's something we can consider.
For me, just going to OCI, it's kind of a step back from where the industry goes. So yeah, definitely, it will be easy to standardize on something like that. I'm just thinking that maybe we can take one step further and see if we can do more intelligent stuff using the Kubernetes APIs, even if we don't run Kubernetes inside. Like which component actually receives, if you're talking about Kubernetes and Kubelet, let's say, which component that actually receives all the REST APIs from the Kubelet CTL and parses that and stuff like that?
So there's various components of Kube. There's the scheduler will decide how to decompose deployments or how to allocate pods to worker nodes and things like that. So
no, but the first component that actually receives the API from the client.
The Kube API server.
Yeah. So can we mandate, for example, Kube API server running on DPUs?
I just don't know if you could mandate some form of single node Kubernetes like Microshift or K3S or something like that. Because if you just put the API server, then you're going to end up implementing one of those micro Kubernetes to actually implement the kubelet and the scheduler and everything that's needed to get a pod running.
I don't think it's useful to think of Kubernetes as an API that there could be multiple implementations of. Like Kubernetes is an implementation which has an API, but you can't implement that API without being Kubernetes.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying of what I'm trying to say as well. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. But what?
So maybe circle back. I want to make sure understand, Boris, exactly where you're headed, because I don't think you want to necessarily run the Kube API server on the DPU. I mean, you may depending on your deployment, but I mean, in general, the Kube API server, kind of lives on your master node, which it may have its own DPU, but that's kind of either here nor there. So let's just say we have a worker node that has a DPU on it, I don't think you necessarily need all the Kubernetes components, like master components, running there. So let's circle back to the beginning. What are we trying to figure out on the DPU itself?
Yeah, so if I want to launch, let's say, Nginx or CNI container like you presented on the DPU from the external orchestrator, whether this external orchestrator itself is a Kubernetes or some application that somebody developed, and I want to now launch the specific, I have an image, I know this image is good, I want to launch this image on the DPU itself. What APIs can I use to actually launch a container, like pull the image inside the DPU, and launch it? Like what usually I would do with Docker, obviously, is, Docker provided with a TCP socket or Podman and provide it with REST APIs, or again, TCP socket to a daemon running inside the DPU, or SSH into DPU, Docker pull, Docker run, all this stuff. So how can I do it remotely without assuming specific implementation of Docker Podman, because we cannot mandate, obviously, that. Make sense, or?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I'm not necessarily the expert there. I'm just trying to figure out outside, if you're running within Kubernetes, you'll need kubelet running down on the DPU.
No, but let's say we're taking your presentation, right, Billy? Just for the sake of the argument. And in your presentation, you showed we have Shim CNI still running in OpenShift on the host. And we have some CNI functionality that was offloaded inside the DPU. And let's say there is no Kubernetes running inside the DPU, you just launch it as a container on the DPU that implements all that functionality that you want to offload to the DPU. Who will launch this pod or container, and how? Is Kubernetes is going to do it? Will Kubernetes see that DPU as additional worker node? Probably not. If you want to create your own Kubernetes cluster only from DPUs, like infrastructure Kubernetes cluster, that's an option, obviously. That's an easy problem to solve.
So, I mean, what we presented was a Kubernetes set of scenarios. So in our presentation, we assumed that you either had a single cluster configuration. We're not sure about how the DPU is viewed just yet. Or you had a 2-cluster configuration, which still meant that you had the full set of entities necessary to run the pods available to you.
Yeah, so if you have 2 Kubernetes cluster, one on the host, one on the DPUs, it's not an interesting discussion because then you can use standard Kubernetes APIs and deploy those pods. That's easy task. But if you cannot assume that there is a Kubernetes running on the DPUs, now what you do? Are you SSHing into DPU to run your container? Do you assume a single Kubernetes node inside each and every DPU? How you communicate with DPUs in order to launch that container that you want there to offload your CNI work?
So if you don't have Kubernetes running on your DPU or as part of it, you will need to write your own lifecycle manager in order to launch the pods. So you can either script it or you can, SSH in and manually start it, but but if it dies, you'll need something that restarts it. So you would have to, whether it's lightweight or not, you would have to write some type of, your own lifecycle manager for those pods.
Or assume that the DPU is a separate node in the same cluster. But those are the 2 options, I think.
Right, but that still assumes Kubernetes at that point.
Yeah,
and I think
sorry.
Boris was saying, if you're not doing Kubernetes, what would you do?
Because we started this conversation with saying that we cannot assume Kubernetes on all the DPUs.
Prasad, you got your hand up.
Yeah, so I think what Billy said is what I had in mind. Isn't that a choice by the DPU anyways to either signal an external entity that I have come up, and then what happens thereafter is left up to the cluster manager and orchestrator. So when the node comes up in a Kubernetes cluster, then the API server decides to deploy pods on that node based on the node selector and things like that.
But who said the DPU is a worker node of the Kubernetes cluster? If you're talking about infrastructure separation and air gapping, we have our Kubernetes cluster running on the server itself. That's completely fine. But who said the DPU must run Kubernetes cluster as well? I don't think we can mandate that. But if this is the case, how can we launch that Kubernetes cluster?
No. So that's what I was saying. So the separation I have in my mind is all the DPU is saying, hey, I'm available here. It doesn't assume Kubernetes or anything. I'm available. So now whoever on the other side is receiving that message, it could be an OPI server or some other agent, that then either relays it further to an infrastructure agent, could be a Kubernetes or some OpenShift or something of that sort, which then decides, okay, I need to now, since I'm running Kubernetes here, so I will try and launch pods and set up things on this node.
But like you SSH into it, you create your own APIs. This is exactly the question. You have your DPU available. Let's say the message got through. A DPU is available to receive workloads. What is this DPU running that can actually receive the workload? We need to pull the image basically and start the image, right? Start the container. These are the most basic operations that we need to resolve.
Okay, I get what your point. So so obviously if you break it down like that, yeah, you don't need. So that's why you're saying Docker, etc. would be needed. Yeah, that's what we assume as well in our environment. Yes. Okay, I get the question. Yeah. So I think that those are implicit in our environments. We assume that when the DPU has come up, those are available.
Yeah, but you assume Docker, and obviously Red Hat assumes Podman, right?
I understand. Fair enough. Yeah.
And we have zero standardization here.
I mean, it doesn't preclude Podman for us. I mean, as a vendor, we just start with Docker in our environment.
I understand.
Yeah, I don't know that we can necessarily standardize on something here. I think that
I'm just-
there's the potential for many different kinds of orchestration. I think, we've had the discussions around, Kubernetes makes sense to help make this space easier. But I don't know that we can necessarily standardize on something that's not Kubernetes here.
But we can standardize on Kubernetes without actually running Kubernetes, for example, as I said, and Billy and others, Donald corrected me that it's going to be a lot of work to actually implement these Kubernetes APIs if we're not actually running Kubernetes inside the DPU by ourselves.
I think their
But
point
also-
is that if you do implement those APIs, then you have implemented Kubernetes. It now is Kubernetes.
No,
By
not
definition.
necessarily. I don't want to deal with networking. I don't want to deal with storage. I only want OCI compliant run environment. So run D, run C, or CSR, OCR,
Right, but you've
CSR.
implemented your own subset of Kubernetes. So it's your own new flavor of Kubernetes, similar to like K3S. It's something else, right? K1S. I don't know.
So maybe we can standardize on we are running single node Kubernetes. That's fine.
But I don't know if it's really the question saying Docker, Podman, or Kubernetes, because also Christophe has presented, I think 1 month ago, it's more what the API, OPI API could expose to the host or what Intel has presented with Ericsson, in fact, between the two layers, so it could be from the host or from some control plane of an infrastructure cluster on both sides. If it's only one node or a cluster, it's open. In this context, it's more what is exposed and what is the relation between the host and the DPU. On saying it's Docker, it's Podman, it's Kubernetes, it's perhaps not the issue here.
But let's say you deployed a lab, your data center with servers, and you have your DPU plugged in. On the servers, you installed OpenShift. And now we say there is a third-party firewall that wants to come and deploy itself. Let's say Nginx wants to deploy itself on all the DPUs. And those DPU-specific vendors don't run Kubernetes, cannot run Kubernetes, don't support it, don't run it, cannot do anything with Kubernetes on the DPUs. What are our options, except for SSH inside?
But how is that firewall going to firewall the traffic? Like, how does it know where the traffic is coming from and going to? Like the question of how the software gets running is just one piece of the larger question of what things do we support and how do you do them?
No,
right?
but
Like-
for networking, we're creating the cloud and we created the cloud APIs or creating them, and now we're discussing the Kubernetes networking APIs in these calls. We have, IPsec APIs defined, and storage APIs. So slowly we're defining all these proprietary or standard APIs for actually doing and configuring things. The only API that we didn't discuss is how you actually launch the applications.
Yeah, but Boris, it's not as simple as just launching the application. It's like launching the application, lifecycle managing it, being able to monitor it, being able to make sure that it has networking connectivity. Like, it's not, if you're talking about launching a container, you need to be able to do all of those things for it on the IPU. So if you don't want to use a container type construct, you're basically launching a raw application on the IPU or the DPU at that point, or working in a bare metal type scenario. And to be honest with you, I don't see what the benefit of wrapping it in a container is going to be for you if that's the situation without the Kubernetes constructs to manage and orchestrate that container.
But we see a lot of vendors, and Marvell also commented here, we see all the vendors or many vendors working either with Docker or Podman and not running Kubernetes on the DPUs yet. So there is a use case for that. There is actual deployments that doing that specifically.
Yes, but that's outside of the scope of what we've presented to date. You know, what we've presented was Kubernetes scenarios and being able to launch pods down on the IPU or the DPU. But
you
if we're
never
saying
said
that,
you never
sorry,
said
but
that you mandate the Kubernetes running on the DPUs.
we never said whether it was a single cluster configuration or a double cluster configuration. But we assumed that the Kubernetes is certainly orchestrating the pods. At least that was my underlying understanding of what we presented. And again, like if we're talking about a scenario which I think is different, is what you're saying, which is we don't have any Kubernetes down below, but we still want to be able to launch an application that's like a bump in the wire type application. How can we do that? I think we need to have a good think about that, but that's definitely not in the scope of what we presented to date.
I understand, but what you're saying actually is you cannot deploy your solution if DPU doesn't support Kubernetes. I think it's a very difficult statement.
I think we've got 4 choices really. You've got host level process orchestration using SSH. You've got Docker, Podman, or you're running Kubelet on the DPU. And when you're running Kubelet on the DPU, you may be running the rest of Kubernetes on the DPU, or you may be running, as Billy said, a Kubernetes control plane on separate nodes. And the kubelet on the DPU is, you know, one of the nodes in that kube cluster, along with all the other DPUs in your cluster. So it then becomes a choice of, are you orchestrating several together using a Kubernetes control plane, or or Docker APIs, or are you going lower level than that and you're using SSH direct to the box?
Ben, you got your hand raised.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking maybe because some of the discussion is because each of the use cases are operating at a different level. Can I quickly share my screen and show something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is again going back to the layer discussion we have in a couple of meetings, right? I'll just quickly explain. So there is a, so I mean, again, the Kubernetes discussion also is because we're thinking, is there a Kubernetes on the host? Is there a Kubernetes on the DPU? So anything below this line it's still work in progress, so bear with me. So there is a DPU, there is a host. At the lowest layer, there are some objects, which is a network interface and a disk, and that is available on the host. And there is a network interface and storage available on the DPU also, but they are exposed to the host because DPU is providing it as, virtualizes it and then provides as one or multiple in different forms, right? So these things are resources that DPU has directly or over the network, and then they're exposing. That's the lowest layer in terms of the use cases requirements that we all are talking about. And what it translates to is that there is an object level API. This is the DPU OPI, DPU OPI API surface. So I'm just showing the layers here horizontally, even the layers we are used to vertically. Bear with me, we have to draw this separately. This is just to gather my thoughts. So unless you have these base objects, and then on top, once you have base objects, how do you connect them? Is there a switch? Is it OVS, OVN? Is it programmable to the P in our OPI? Is OPI is in programmability, right? We haven't talked about enough of that. And then, and is it DPDK P4? And these can coexist, and there is some SiSonic discussion. So So there is a way to connect these objects and the data pipeline needs to be built. I somehow believe that storage also can be explained with P4. When I look at P4 as a modeling and a description language, but we don't want to bring in storage too early, but
Venkat, how this is related to what we're discussing so far,
So-
launching applications on the DPU?
Yeah, I'll tell you, right? So, so I'm saying, so I feel that when somebody is saying, hey, what is happening with Kubernetes? So this Kubernetes is sitting on all these layers. So all these are all the assumptions. You assume that there are some objects, you assume like interfaces, and then you assume that there is a switch there and there's a sonic. And the problem definition for each of us, when I look at different discussions and proposals, they're operating at a different layer. Let's say for Nginx is, wants to deploy applications. And that means everything below that, which means all the things that are left to this, are all being configured to a certain point, and then Nginx would come and then create an application deployment platform. In one use case, Nginx is many things, but in one use case, right? So some of the questions you are asking, Boris, is that, do I have a Kubernetes cluster here? It's a choice, and you could have Docker. And if you have a Kubernetes cluster, is anything that's happening in the Docker here? Is there another cluster here? Is there a set of applications that make sense to be deployed into a cluster which the host becomes part of? Is there a separate Kubernetes cluster where the DPU is part of, right? And the way I am able to at least visualize it is that there is a cluster here, there is a cluster here. You want to accelerate the host-based Kubernetes cluster in the DPU. How you do it is your implementation. Or we could mandate saying that if you have, again, I don't know what's the right answer, right? Having another Kubernetes cluster makes it easier to offload, or it would they look like two separate clusters and they will somehow interoperate and they're controlled separately. So the reason I'm just showing this diagram is just how I am able to see it. Maybe if we develop it, it might answer some of your questions.
It didn't help me at all with.
Okay, so I'll
No,
stop.
sorry.
Then I will come back and maybe once they refine, I can. Yeah.
I think that the fact is there are DPU vendors that are unable to run Kubernetes on the DPUs. And the question is, with everything that Miriam and Billy and others presented, do we have to mandate the Kubernetes is running on DPU or not?
I don't think so, Boris. Like, I mean, the option there is that you don't have to run that application down on the DPU or the IPU. There's no reason why it can't still run on the host side and be serviced like every other pod,
No, but I do
that's
want
just-
to run
that's just
application
the
on
deploy.
DPU.
But like this is the problem that we get in, the construct that we get into. If you want to run an application on the DPU and still have Kubernetes on the host side, you still need to be able to manage, lifecycle manage and monitor that application. And how are you going to do that? And that becomes, I think, a vendor choice at that point. If you can support Kubernetes.
I haven't been following the provisioning and lifecycle discussions, so I don't know where they've got to, but it doesn't feel like we can mandate or do anything more than recommend anything in this in the API working group. I mean, given that you can,
Donald, I'm leading the lifecycle provisioning. This is why I came here. Because
Sure,
we
okay.
didn't make an advancement there, so I thought that I bring it in this group.
Maybe one approach
No,
is
it's just-
OPI to mandate OCI and recommend to support either Docker API or Kubernetes API. If it is a Docker API, we just need a Docker client to make a request. But if it is a Kubernetes API, running the kubelet on the DPU is easy, but it requires a separate Kubernetes master node, which is not just a client. You have to set up the server, which works for some customers, but customers just using the single DPU, probably it's overkill.
But
So I
you can
think
run K3S as a single node cluster on the DPU.
Yeah, that's true, but that requires the memories. So if the DPU has enough CPU and memory, running the K3S is fine. And if we can mandate like a K3S requires at least like a 300 megabyte or maybe 500 megabyte. And that may be okay for the powerful DPU, but if we consider a small edge case and very less powerful DPU, that's maybe overkill. So, but I think the requiring the OCI is already the very good step forward, because then we can share the same container image for all DPUs. And then for the deployment, maybe we can go either recommending Docker or Kubernetes.
C'est Podman on Kubernetes.
Podman is fine. Yeah, I'm saying we can maybe leave it as a recommendation for the deployment side.
I don't think that standardizing on OCI is easy, but I don't think it's getting us anywhere. Because I'm looking at myself, for example, as I'm writing control plane. I have the lab that is full of DPUs. I'm doing my own lifecycle management, for example. I'm deploying my own applications. What can I do except for SSHing?
I understand, but my point is some DPU doesn't support OCI because the kernel is stripped for the C groups or those kind of stuff. So supporting OCI is already the one step forward to meet.
Stephen, you got your, no, I'm sorry, Prasad, I think you had your hand up next. Then we'll go to Stephen.
Yeah, so Boris, maybe I didn't quite understand the challenge in terms of connecting lifecycle management. Let me phrase my thought here. So today, the lifecycle management allows an operator to configure what image they would like to boot on the DPU. Then as part of that, isn't there an opportunity for the operator, who's also, I assume, administrating the orchestrator, to make sure the tools needed to communicate with the orchestration services are built into that image when the DPU comes up? And isn't that then sufficient to establish the bootstrapping needed for the communication between DPU and the services? So with Kubernetes as an example, you would load in the Docker and SSH and maybe kubelet and things like that already in the image. Is the assumption that not all DPUs can support these things? Is that where this question is?
Not all DPUs can run Kubernetes, yes.
No, not all DPUs can support these tools. I mean, these are like standard tools which would run on ARM cores. They don't need extra. Sorry?
What are those standard tools you're referring to?
They are user space applications that run on ARM cores. They assume Linux kernel at the base. So are we saying there are DPUs out there that cannot do this? Is that the reason this is coming up? Because any DPU that has ARM cores and runs on Linux should be able to run these applications.
That's not true. The Linux, you can configure the kernel. I have seen some DPU has kernel with stripped a lot of configuration. And things like C groups is one example. And that is required for the OCI.
No, I agree. But that are you saying you cannot change the kernel configuration? The DPU doesn't allow you to boot the kernel with.
I have seen such DPU, yes.
Okay. So yeah, I mean,
isn't the scope of OPI to support a general open source Linux distribution though? So it's something that can't run that would be out of scope.
Containers. I'm with you, Donald. Let's say we agree that we can run containers on the DPU. Standard Linux, we can run containers. Still, I'm not sure I understand how we can remotely, how can we launch containers?
So I don't know if we can mandate anything, but we don't want to invent anything new either. And so the choices end up being, if you've got choices of how to lifecycle manage processes or things. So you can use systemd orchestration, in which case you're going to need SSH admin access onto the DPU to perform any operations. And it's going to be package level loading, so D package or RPMs or whatever. The next level up, you've got Docker or Podman, and so you've got authenticated access through some kind of socket, but you don't have any finer grain control than that. And then if you go to Kubernetes orchestration, then you've got full role-based access control. So partly the choice is down to what level of access control you need, and partly the choice is down to how much power you need in terms of network orchestration, in terms of lifecycle management and monitoring and everything like that Mariam mentioned earlier. So you go big with Kubernetes if you need all the richness, and you go smaller with Podman, or you go smaller still and just systemd lifecycle manage, depending on the fundamental use case. And I don't know if we can mandate anything beyond that, just other than making recommendations.
Stephen, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so Donald covered a good portion of what I was going to say. It sounds like what you're asking for, Boris, is a way to orchestrate without using Kubernetes. And there are other orchestration options besides SSH. I mean, you've got things like Ansible that can orchestrate container deployments today. There are other products out there that will manage containers besides just Kubernetes. But as Donald said, I don't know that we can mandate any of those.
Yeah, I was looking at the different levels. So we have run D really, really low. We have Creo on top. Maybe we Cryo. This is our kind of maybe standardization, which is a little bit better than OCI. I'm just looking on different levels and OCI compatibility runtimes. So Cryo is on top of OCI. So OCI is very, very low level. And maybe with Cryo running on top, we can have a much better story without mandating the full Kubernetes, but standardizing on the gRPCs as Cryo exposes.
So Cryo is an implementation of the Kubernetes CRI, Container Runtime Interface, as is Containerd and a few others.
Yeah.
It's basically an abstraction of the Docker and Podman APIs.
Exactly.
But explicitly targeted at exactly the functionality that Kubernetes wants. So,
but that's fine. Maybe OPI, if we can follow you on point then. So I just want to explore this a little bit more. Maybe this is exactly what we can standardize on. We understand that we want Kubernetes-like experience. We know that not all DPU vendors can support actual full-blown Kubernetes running on the DPUs. So maybe this abstraction on top of Podman and Docker, which is Cryo, can be an excellent solution for us to standardize on. Because it's a standard in a Kubernetes environment. It have APIs abstractions on top of all the different low levels and everything. And Kubernetes supports it, so isn't that a good choice for standardization?
If I may, I mean, I don't think that you can. You need like a pluggable architecture somehow below the API, right? If you say that I create an API for the IPU vendors in order to actually be able to to spin up applications, right? Then you need to have an abstract API that allows you to create application, but the plugin underneath needs to support a specific implementation, right? So the plugin underneath can actually support a Kubernetes type of implementation of the application or a simple Docker implementation of the application. But I don't think you can say that I can standardize for a more Docker approach or for a more Kubernetes approach. The only thing that you can do is to create like an abstract API and a pluggable framework underneath.
But isn't that exactly what CRI-O provides us? An abstraction layer on top of Docker and Podman and on top of simple low-level OCI. Let's say, just for the sake of the argument, let's say we adopt CRI-O as an abstraction API layer that mandated by OPI. If you want to run Kubernetes inside DPU, you covered. If you don't want and you run Docker or Podman, you also covered. So what is the downside of standardizing on something like that?
I cannot argue about CRI-O. I'm not really familiar with that, so I will pass.
So I guess one of the possible downsides is what Mariam was saying before. You don't get the management, right? You're on the hook for restarting your pods yourself and things like that.
Absolutely. So you will use Kubernetes to give you additional functionality. Absolutely, if you can.
And then the other downside is what I was saying before, that it's not currently thought of as being a public API, but it's sort of an internal implementation detail of Kubernetes. But I guess if we were going to use it, then we might be able to get Kubernetes to start thinking of it more as being an API that other people used as well.
I'm just looking on the website. I see that Minikube uses CRI-O, KubeAdmin can work with CRI-O. So we can use standard.
CRI-O is one implementation. CRI is the general API.
Yeah. You're right. Yes, I was intended to say that. Yeah, sorry, CRI. Because for me, it's another abstraction on top of OCI. So the CRI. I think in OCI is too low level to standardize on, and maybe with CRI we have a better story here.
Again, I think we should go back to the use cases and see if that's the right answer.
I don't know. I'm struggling to see the benefit of leveraging the capability to run containers on the DPU and having to reinvent all of the orchestration pieces to monitor and lifecycle manage that.
But can you, Miriam, can you realistically run OpenShift, full-blown OpenShift without downsizing it to something really edge targeted? I don't remember what's your product called, which is,
Microshift. There's Microshift, there's K3S, there's other options out there for sure.
Yeah.
But that would mean you're mandating a double cluster scenario, whereby you have an infrastructure cluster for your IPUs and then you have a tenant cluster for your hosts.
It could be single node cluster. It doesn't have to be, cluster.
Yeah, but the single node is also as an independent cluster, so it could be seen as two clusters also for single node.
What I'm looking at is to use the standard tooling, like if we can, of course, if we can standardize on the single node cluster, and we don't care about implementation. You can use K3S, you can use Microshift, you can use whatever product that you want. We don't care, as long as the customer can use the standard tooling commands without reinventing the wheel and potentially without SSH into anything, to launch and lifecycle maybe the applications on the on the DPUs. This is the ask, I guess. If all DPU vendors can run any kind of Kubernetes, we cover, that's perfectly fine. Let's mandate it and we're done with that.
So this is kind of a half-baked thought, but if the DPU is required to run a CRI compliant runtime, then in theory, you could run a kubelet for the DPU somewhere else. And so you could, even if the DPU itself doesn't run Kubernetes, you could still run a Kubernetes cluster whose nodes were the DPUs by talking to the CRI implementations on the DPUs.
You
and so
exactly
get all the management you need, even though the DPU itself doesn't support Kubernetes.
You exactly on my point previously. This is what I was thinking. Why standardizing on CRI it can be really useful. You can then run your control plane somewhere else, and then once this is CRI compliant, you can then use all the standard tooling to actually talk to your DPU. Then absolutely, this is my thinking as well. Any cons on this approach? Like people want to take time, think about that a bit more.
No, I was going to ask Dan a quick question. So, and like you said, it was half baked, so I don't expect the whole architecture. But if kubelet's running off, how is kubelet talking to your runtime? Because is it doing messaging? Does it naturally do messaging there, or?
Yeah,
when it's
kubelet,
talking to the CNI, it talks direct function calls, but I don't know how it talks to the CRI.
kubelet doesn't talk to CNI anymore. The CRI talks to CNI.
Okay.
So yeah, it's all gRPC based. You'd need to make sure that there were like, TLS certificates there, but
yeah. Okay. That's just below what I've messed with. So
I probably
I
should
see that CRI supports gRPC, yeah, like Dan is saying.
I probably should have introduced myself earlier. Hi, everyone. Dan Winship. I'm also at Red Hat. I'm involved a lot with Kubernetes upstream stuff. So the rest of the OPI team dragged me into this.
We're really glad to hear that. So can we take this as a working assumption and try to a little bit deep dive on this approach from that Dan suggested? Standardizing on CRI. You can run either kubelet inside or outside, we don't care. But this is a standard in OPI to run and lifecycle manage maybe, potentially. Launch applications and stuff like that.
So, sorry, one question. So the summary you just gave is just saying, is not dictating a new API or a standard. All it is saying is CRI is sufficient. Or did I misunderstand?
Because CRI already has well-defined gRPC-based API, so we're basically standardizing on that APIs.
Yeah, but those APIs allow interaction with kubelet.
Yes.
No, well, kubelet can interact with those APIs. It doesn't call out to kubelet or anything like that.
Yeah, so it's offering the service to kubelet. Okay, so but the question is, must the DPU expose that API?
Yes.
I mean, you option saying kubelet can be on or off. Is that a vendor choice? If it's a vendor choice, then I would just run kubelet on the DPU. I'm not exposing CRI.
You are exposing CRI because you're running CRI on the DPUs, right?
Right, but but that's not what I want to expose, because I can offer a richer set of services by
You can
running.
expose that in addition. Nobody is stopping you exposing anything else in addition to the CRI, but CRIs must be exposed. This is what the proposal is.
Correct. So yeah, I get that, which is why I'm saying, yeah, so you are forcing a vendor to expose it, even though the vendor can do better.
Yes.
Yeah, so then I would, there's no reason I see why I should support it, right? Because it just increases the burden on me as a vendor to support something that I feel is completely redundant. It is meant to handle another vendor who is unable to run standard Linux standard applications on their DPU?
Because the customers will ask for it. Customers that have different multiple DPU vendors that want to use exactly the same tooling. Yeah.
Correct. So what I'm saying is I have another mechanism to provide the customer need, which is I'll say, hey, rebuild the image with whatever tools you want on that image, load it on the DPU, and you're up and
If
running.
DPU doesn't have enough memory to run full-blown Kubernetes, then you.
No, that is what I'm saying. That is me as a vendor. I can solve that problem. If some other vendor is unable to solve it, I understand OPI offering them a solution, a way out. But mandating it for me as a vendor who can do better, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, but building an image is really static, or you are saying rebuilding an image for every change?
No, I'm building an image that is being deployed by the lifecycle that is aware of the orchestration being used in that cluster. So if you are running OpenShift, you make sure the images that go onto, say, the Marvell DPUs have the tools needed to be compatible with OpenShift already. That can be arranged.
But it's not an OPI API question. It's a way of deploying on the. And to go back to the CRI topic, yeah. So because it could be, I don't know if it could, but exposed to the host or exposed to internal, because it's what Mariam has presented. Where should be the API? So the API could be presented at multiple. Yeah. Because so it's not only something that could be allowed from the host if you want to provide, for example, some security features. It could be exposed internally or exposed to the host in the context of single node or isolated hosts.
Okay. Well, we've reached the top of the hour. This is something that we probably need to think about over the next week, and we'll pick up the discussion next week. And continue to try to flush this out so we can make a decision on, is this something we standardize on, or is this something that we need to just continue to consider other options? All right. I will put this on the agenda for next week. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.